Welcome to my 174th video on my work with OO gauge. This part is another kit build video. This time I'll be building a card kit for a railway building, Superquick Series A number 5 for a Two Road Locomotive Shed. Superquick kits are pretty involved to build, so I'm afraid that this will be quite a long video, chiefly of interest to folks considering building this kit themselves. Here's the kit as it comes, standard Superquick packaging with everything in a plastic bag, something like legal stationery size. This one is pretty heavy, letting us know that this will be a substantial kit. But this is mainly just a question of this being a large building, and so obviously needing larger parts. This one is not actually very complex as Superquick kits go. It only took me 2 days to build, about 10 hours, and I'm sure that lots of people could build it faster, but I like to take my time and be very methodical with these things. By comparison, the Superquick Terminus Station Kit A10 took me 4 long days to build, well over 20 hours. Here's what you get when the kit is unpacked. 2 folded sheets of card parts, 1 triple, 1 double, so basically 5 sheets in all. 3 sheets of paper parts, a small sheet of transparent acetate glazing parts, a single 2-sided black and white sheet of instructions, and a warranty card. When this one came to me, quite a number of the card parts were falling out of the sheets. This may have been because the kit got shaken up in shipping, as I had to order it from the UK, as it wasn't available locally in Canada where I live. I haven't had parts falling out of the sheets on arrival with other Superquick kits. It's not very convenient when this happens, as it can make the parts harder to identify, as the identification information is often printed on the sheet beside the part, and of course it increases the likelihood of parts getting lost. Here's the first side of the instruction sheet. As is usual with Superquick kits, the instructions are heavily verbal, in English only, with minimal diagrams. If you don't read and understand English well, you're going to find it very hard to build one of these kits. And frankly, well, I'm a native speaker and I have a graduate degree, and I still found some of the instructions for this one next to impossible to understand. Here's the back of the instruction sheet, so that's all of the instructions that you've seen there. I'll focus on some of them in more detail as we go along with the build. Here I have separated the 5 sheets of card parts. Although the Superquick card parts come as folded sheets, you're generally safe to separate the sheets right at the starts. Certainly if the sheets are only joined together at the edges, as is generally the case, it'll be safe to separate them, and will make handling the sheets and finding parts easier. The sheets in this kit were clearly numbered, and the instructions did tell you on which sheet specific parts would be found. Here's the marking for sheet 1, which had the ends of the main building and some other parts. Here's the marking for sheet 2, containing the main roof and the side paving. Here are the markings for sheets 3, 4, and 5. Sheet 3 had the inner side walls and the parts for the roof ventilators, which had mostly fallen out. Sheet 5 had the outer side walls. Sheet 4 had the overlays for the outer side walls and parts for the small office annex. The stack of parts seen in the middle here were for the louvered roof ventilators. They aren't used until quite late in the build, but they were mostly falling out of the sheet when my kit came, so I took all of them out, stacked them, and put them to one side. Here are the 3 sheets of paper parts labelled A, B, and C, and the single sheet of glazing parts. Before I get started on the actual build, I just want to summarise my feelings regarding this kit a bit. I've built many Superquick kits before, and you can see kit builds for most of them in this video series. If this had been my very first Superquick kit build, I don't know that I would ever have bought another one. Some aspects of the kit are good. The textures are printed nicely and give a good appearance, and overall the kit can be made up to quite a nice looking building, but there were many issues with this kit. Frankly, I got the impression that Superquick just couldn't be bothered to make the kit properly, so they just sent it out with parts the wrong size that wouldn't fit together and left it up to the person building the kit to try to fix things as best as they could. And this is repeatedly clear in the instructions themselves, where they say things like, you may need to trim such and such a part to get it to fit. And it often isn't really exactly clear what you should be aiming for when you do this trimming. Apart from these issues, there are also places where what the instructions tell you to do doesn't match with how the parts themselves come, and at least one place with a clear error in printing in the instruction sheet. To say nothing of the fact that, as mentioned already, some of the instructions are next to incomprehensible. All of these things would be more understandable if this were a kit that had just been rushed into production by a new company. In that case, I'd feel sympathy, but I believe that Superquick have been selling this kit for something like 50 years, so clearly they don't care enough about all these deficiencies and errors to do anything about them apart from some vague warnings in the instructions. I don't want to discourage anyone thinking of building this kit too much. It can make quite a nice-looking building. Indeed, I bought this kit because I like the look of the building on someone else's layout, but you do need to be prepared for some struggles and likely some confusion going into working on this kit. With that said, on with the build. The side walls are the first thing to be made up. They will be made up of several layers. These are the main parts for the outer side walls on sheet 5. Note that the two sides are different, and they are clearly labelled as sidewall A1 and sidewall B1. A1 has 3 full-size windows and 1 small one, whereas B1 has 4 full-size windows. The small outer office will be eventually attached to wall A1 under the small window. Starting with wall A1, the window blanks are removed. It's best to use care and help with a sharp knife so you don't get torn bits in the corners, etc. This is the glazing sheet. Superquick always print their glazing parts extremely close together. If they could just spare another inch or so of acetate so that the parts could have decent borders round them, it would make cutting them out and fixing the parts in place so much easier. Personally, when I cut out the glazing parts, I leave as much extra acetate attached to them as I can, as this makes it easier to glue the parts in place. Usually the Superquick instructions tell you to fix the glazing parts in place with sellotape. In this case, the instructions actually say to either use sellotape or glue the parts in place. I've always glued the Superquick glazing parts in place regardless of what the instructions say, but given the narrow borders, you do have to be very careful with your glue to avoid spoiling the visible surface of the windows. Here you can see how I glued the glazing parts to side wall A1. Where I could use wide extensions I did. Where those weren't available, I used small spots of glue in the corner of the part. I used rocket card glue for all of my card kit assembly. The fine applicator tip really helps with placing small amounts of glue precisely. Here's that wall seen from the outside with the glazing in place. Next, the tabs at the bottom and top of that wall need to be bent back and glued. This was quite tricky to do, as they were very long, narrow tabs, not readily made to bend back and sit down. That is, when you bent them down, they kept popping up. I used a metal ruler to help me bend the tabs back and hold them down until the glue took hold. Rocket glue will generally take fairly quickly, so even with tension parts like this, it's only necessary to hold the join for a minute or two. Here's that part from the inside with both tabs glued down. Next, the inner wall would be attached to the outer wall. The inner wall parts on sheet 3 in my kit weren't terribly well printed, with a lot of black blotching, but these parts will be inside the shed, and anyway I don't imagine the Loco shed walls would be particularly clean in real life. I don't think the blotching was deliberate, though. It looked like what my laser printer does if I spill some toner when I'm replacing it. The appropriate inner wall part, the one with a small window, is taken out and the window blanks are removed. Then that part glues to the inside of the wall, aligned at the ends, and sat down on the bottom tab, leaving a groove under the top tab. This is made clear in the instructions. Care needs to be taken laying the part into place to get it properly aligned, as you won't get any real chance to adjust such a large part glued along its whole length. Next, an outer wall facing will be attached. The outer facings are on sheet 4. The two outer facings are clearly labelled as to which side wall they go with. We're doing wall A first, so we want the one on the left. This part has other parts embedded in it, so those will need to be taken out and set aside. White parts with a W in a circle on them are specifically identified as waste and should be removed and discarded. So this will be taken out and set aside for use when we get to the outer office annex. Here's that facing part with the waste and embedded parts removed. Here are the instructions for gluing the outer facing in place. These make sense, and there's even a diagram to clarify. You can see how the facing is going to fit around the printed textures on the outer wall. And here is that facing in place, completing the assembly of this side wall. Now we need to do essentially the same operation to the other side. Here's the second side wall with its glazing glued in place. There's only one more glazing piece left after this. Again, we fold the tabs back and glue them down, holding them firmly with a ruler until the glue takes. Then the inner wall is glued on flush with the bottom tab, leaving a groove at the top. Finally, the facing needs to be glued on. In this case, it's less obvious which way up it goes, and you could fairly easily put it on upside down. One indicator of which way up it goes comes from the downpipes. This is clearly meant to be the top of the downpipe. You could also just compare to the first wall, so the white strip goes along the bottom and the divided grey edge at the top. Here are both side walls completed. Here is instruction 4 dealing with the inner offices, together with figure 3 illustrating the assembly of these. The problem here was that the instructions didn't really match how the parts came. Here are those inner offices on sheet 1 inside the main front wall. The instruction implied clearly that the inner offices should be dealt with separately, but they came attached to the front wall, as seen here. In hindsight, I believe it would have been best to leave them attached to the front wall, as they do really join to it like that. But I followed the instructions and cut the office parts off, although I was clearly cutting through what had been made as a bend in the parts sheet. On the other hand, the instructions implied that the ceilings should be attached to the office parts, but they were actually cut right through and falling off, so I joined them back on with tape on the back. And here are those office parts assembled as per the diagram in the instructions. Side walls bent back round the floor part and ceiling bent back and glued to the top of the side wall, as shown in figure 3 here. Next, the front wall itself needs to be made up. 5 parts are used for this: the main outer wall, an inner card layer, a paper cover for the inside, and 2 card strengtheners for the corners. The Superquick paper parts are not pre-cut in any way, so you need to carefully cut them out yourself. Scissors are illustrated, but I used a sharp knife. I cut the centre out roughly first, just to get it out of the way. Then I cut along all of the inner straight edges with a metal ruler and a sharp knife. I put a new blade into my knife before starting this kit, as it really does help if the knife is very sharp and clean. Finally, I cut the outer edges, freeing the paper part from the front wall. See instruction 5 here, re the assembly of the front wall. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff about trimming things here, and a diagram that sort of shows what you're trying to achieve. I really wasn't all that clear about this, and I don't think I got it entirely right. As the parts came, the 2 sides of the inner and outer walls certainly didn't fit together the same. There was a bigger gap on one side than the other. I trimmed the inner part, but in hindsight I'm none too clear if trimming this helped. It might almost have been better to trim the outer part, but the instructions said to trim the inner part. Here I've glued the inner card part to the back of the main front wall. As I say, I did not alter the outer wall, I just trimmed the inner part a bit. And then I glued the paper part over the inner part. Is there any real point in having that inner paper part? Well, I suppose you might manage to see it when the building is completed if you peer through the windows. I glued the strengtheners over the white spaces on the paper part as instructed, although they didn't fit exactly into the white spaces, but at least they give you a general idea where they're supposed to go. This is a paper door part that needs to be cut out for use with the back wall. Again, the instructions indicate that the inner wall parts and the outer wall parts probably won't fit together properly, so you have to trim. I was getting a bit more cautious and savvy about this by this point. I used the side wall assembly to mark on the outer back wall the thickness that would be needed for the side wall to fit neatly against the end. I did that on both sides, then I tried the parts for the inner back wall. In this case there were two inner parts that needed to be joined in the middle. Indeed, they did need trimming, as if I lined the left edge up leaving the proper clearance for the side wall, there was almost no clearance for the side wall on the right. I trimmed a sliver off one of the inner wall parts where they met in the middle to make their joined width fit between the clearances required for the side walls. The paper door is glued to the back of the opening in the outer back wall first. Here's the inside of the back wall with the paper door in place and my markings for the side wall clearances. The instructions suggest joining the two inner back wall parts with a paper strip before gluing them to the outer wall. I marked the size for a joining strip on the side of paper parts sheet A, where there was plenty of spare paper. I cut that strip out and used it to join the two inner back wall parts. Here's the back of those two parts joined by the paper strip. Then I glued those joined parts to the outer back wall, lined up with my clearance marks on either side. Here's where the instructions tell you to glue the inner offices to the front wall. As I said, in hindsight, I think it might have been better just to leave them attached by their edges as they came. But since I'd followed the instructions and made them up separately, I needed to glue them to the front wall now. If they'd been left joined, they would have just been sitting in the middle, and I could simply have folded them back and glued them in place at this point. It was rather fiddly to glue the offices in place, as they could only be attached by the edge of one wall and the edge of the floor. Here's one of the offices in place. You can see that its wall has been glued to the side of the arch where it originally came attached. And here are both of those inner offices in place on the front wall. The side walls are now going to be glued on. The side walls will butt up against the back of the front wall, so the edges of the front wall will be very visible. So I used a brown marker to colour those edges before making the attachment. Here's the section of the instructions relating to attaching the side walls. The walls are labelled incorrectly in this instruction diagram. The wall labelled B here is actually the one for which the parts were labelled A, and vice versa. I glued the side wall A in place first, the real A wall, the one that was labelled B in the instruction diagram. I lined it up with the edge of the front wall. The side wall didn't really fit with the inner front wall or the office wall. Maybe rather than trimming the inner front wall, I would have been better to just glue it further over to this side. But the instructions did say to trim it to make the two sides even. Fortunately, this is all going to be hidden inside the finished building, so hopefully this messy fit will never be noticeable. I used an emery board to sand the ends of the side walls a bit, as I hadn't managed to get the ends of the various layers perfectly even, and an even edge was really wanted to make a good join. Here I've got both side walls glued to the front wall, concentrating on aligning the corners exactly and not worrying too much about the interior fit. Then the back wall needs to go on. Again, its edges will be visible, so I coloured them with a marker. Then I glued the first corner of the back wall in place. This fitted better as I had measured the internal clearance carefully, but even so, the outside alignment of the corner is what's most important, as that is what will be seen. I didn't try to do both corners of the back wall at the same time, better to do one at a time and concentrate on getting it neat. Finally, I did the fourth corner. It went together reasonably well. I squared the building based on the markings on my cutting board and left it whilst the glue set more. After the corner joins had set, I glued in the inner offices back against the side walls. This one fitted quite well, but the other really didn't fit. It almost looks as though things would have fitted better if this side of the outer front wall had been trimmed down a bit. I used a black marker to colour the edges of the office roofs, so they won't be very visible. Next to be dealt with was the main roof. This came as a single part on sheet 2. The instructions said to fit the roof without glue and then to glue it from underneath. This seemed to be indeed the best way to proceed. The edges of the roof fitted into the grooves that were left in the top of the side walls between the inner wall part and the top tab. So long as you left those grooves properly, you should be able to fit the sides of the roof part into them. Then the roof can be glued in place from the inside. Here I have applied the glue along the left side, as seen in this picture, the top side. Given how long the join is, you will need to push the roof and the wall together in order to keep them in contact for the whole length whilst the glue takes. Once the two sides have been glued, the ends can be glued. The end should go over the top of the inner wall parts, and I found that it took a bit of persuading to get them to do so. Here's the final section of the roof to be glued, the back end sitting over the inner back wall, so up against the outer back wall. And here is the main roof in place. The instructions say to use a generous, that's their word, amount of glue on those inner joins, and they're basically right, since you're not actually applying the glue to the surfaces before they're joined. But so long as you do get a good amount of glue all along those joins, the roof should be well fitted and firmly held in place. Now the roof strengthener needs to be fitted, essentially a centre truss for the roof. As you can see from the instruction here, this is another part where Superquick pretty much knew they had made the part wrong, so the instructions advise you to trim it if necessary. I think they knew darned well it would be necessary. Actually, I couldn't even understand this instruction at first. What am I supposed to trim? But when I started with the actual part, it became apparent. Here's the part as it comes from the sheet. When the tab is bent back, it doesn't fit properly behind the upper part. The tab is too big and sticks out. So what you need to trim is the ends of the tab, otherwise the part won't fit properly up against the roof. With the tab trimmed flush with the upper section, the part is glued up against the roof, somewhere around the middle, just to give some sort of extra support to the angle of the roof. It's perhaps worth mentioning that the Metcalf engine shed kits have much more extensive provision for multiple roof struts, which both support the roof and look correct cosmetically. Next, the roof louver vents need to be dealt with. The parts for these are another case where Superquick couldn't be bothered to actually make the parts the size they needed to be. As is made clear in the instructions here, the spacers are supposed to be smaller than the louvers themselves, so that gaps will be left between the ends of the louvers. But Superquick made all of the parts, spacers and louvers, exactly the same size, so you need to separate out the spacers and cut them all down on both sides to be narrower than the louvers. The white parts with the black edges are the louvers, and the grey parts are the spacers. I used a black marker to blacken the edges of the louvers, as otherwise they would have showed white, which wouldn't have looked right. Then I trimmed down both sides of each spacer part with a steel ruler and a sharp knife. I took a bit over 1/16 of an inch off each side of each part. You can see the bits trimmed off at back right here. In addition to the louver and spacer parts, there are also roof and end parts for the ventilators. Here are those end parts separated. One of them wasn't printed correctly, so I did my best to correct it with marker and pencil. The second from the left here. Here are all of those parts for the roof ventilators, with the end parts touched up, the one at right now, and all of the other parts bent to a reasonable angle, ready for assembly. It's better to pre-bend them before you try and stick them together. The assembly starts by gluing one of the louver parts over the white section in the top of the main roof. Then you continue by alternately gluing spacer parts and louver parts in place until you've fitted 3 of each. Then the ends are glued on. As you can see, the ends stick up way above the top spacer, so really that top spacer serves no purpose, but this was how the instructions said to do the assembly. Finally, the roof is glued over the ventilator. Since the ends stick up, the roof is only attached to the ends. Then the second ventilator is done in the same way. Here all of its parts are in place except for the roof. And here's the building now with both ventilators complete. Next, ridge tiles are fitted to the roof. The idea with these Superquick paper parts is that you prick through the paper where the red arrows are at the ends, then turn it over and score the back between your prick marks for the centre folds of the tiles. Then you cut out the parts. I forgot to photograph the process of scoring the back, but it needs to be done again later for the gutter and the chimney, so I'll show it there. Once the ridge tile parts are cut out, they're bent in the middle. A steel ruler is useful to help with this. Because they were scored on the back rather than the front, there will be no white paper showing at the fold on the top, which is why it's better to score them on the back. The ridge tiles are then glued in place along the ridge of the roof, between the ventilators and the roof ends. Some trimming of the ridge tile parts was necessary to get them to fit into the sections of the roof, so you need to try them first, trim them to length, and then stick them in place. Next, the copings need to be fitted as per instruction 11. These are the coping parts. The parts up front are for the end walls. I wasn't clear whether the intention was to provide a single folded part or 2 separate parts. One fell apart, the other stayed joined. Here's the coping glued over the top of the front wall, and here over the top of the back wall. Then the coping is glued along the top of the side walls. Unfortunately, there didn't seem to be any way to really get the coping to join up well in the corners. Next, the small outer office annex needs to be assembled. I found instruction 12, one of the more opaque. Here's the office paving part with the tab mentioned. I've folded up the tab and glued it. I wasn't clear whether this tab should remain attached to the paving or be detached. Actually, I think either way would work. Here are the other parts for the office, the main walls at back right, the backing at front, and the roof and chimney top at back left. At first I thought the second side was supposed to stay attached to the backing, but given how the backing needs to fit around the door and window, the side wall would be on the wrong end, so it must be detached. The door is a paper part cut from sheet A. Actually, I might be wrong about that. Maybe the door was a card part, but it's a separate door part for sure. The last glazing part is used for the office window. As usual, I left as much extra acetate on as possible when attaching the glazing part. Here are the office walls from the outside with the glazing fitted and the tab bent back. The backing pretty much had to be fitted like this in order to go around the door and the window openings. Then the door is fitted to the back of the door gap. At this point I decided to detach the doubled tab from the paving. Well, it pretty much fell off. I glued the front wall of the office and folded the side wall round the doubled tab. Then the loose side wall needs to go on the other end, but the front wall protruded too much. So I trimmed a bit off the end of the front wall. Then I fixed the second side wall in place, gluing it to the tab and the end of the front wall. The paving fits into the notch that was left at the bottom of the outer side wall. It needs to be lined up with the back wall of the office, which is printed on the side wall. Actually, the drain on the paving at left, which needs to be lined up with the downpipe, is perhaps the best indicator of the proper alignment. I glued this on a piece of scrap foam board to avoid getting glue on my cutting mat, since you're gluing right on the bottom level. Once the paving is glued in place, the assembled office is glued over the gap in the paving. The downpipe didn't quite line up with the drain in this case, but the walls had to be aligned with the gap in the paving. Next, there is a gutter to be fitted to the office roof. Honestly, I hate working with Superquick gutters. All of their kits have them pretty much, but I put up with it as they probably do add something to the finished building. At least there was only one piece of guttering in this kit. This is scored at the back, as discussed before. You can see here where I've pricked through at the ends based on the red arrows and then scored between those prick marks on the back. Then the part is cut out. At this point, I always colour the part with a black marker, going round the outer edges and over all those dotted lines, which I don't want to be seen when the gutter is fitted. Then the black part of the gutter is folded back along the scored line and glued down double. The back tab is folded up at an angle. You can see my marker colouring here. Then the tab glues under the front edge of the roof, so creating a black gutter along that roof edge and protruding slightly from the ends. Note that the back of the roof has a notch at one end. This is to allow the roof to fit against the side wall, which has an extra layer at the end. So here's that office annex in place with its roof, just the chimney to be done now. The chimney stack is another paper part, and like the other paper parts, it needs to be scored on the back. Here's the back with the prick-through marks and the scores between them. Then the part is cut out and folded along those scored lines. Here are the instructions for making the chimney pot. If there was a part provided for the chimney pot, I must have inadvertently thrown it away. Certainly I couldn't find any such part when I got to this instruction. The instruction doesn't mention where the part was supposed to be located. Fortunately, I had Metcalf chimney pot strips left over from Metcalf kits that I'd built before. Metcalf tend to give you a few extra, which is a good idea, as rolling them is tricky and you can easily mess them up. If you didn't have a part, you could just make a strip of coloured paper, black on one side and something like terracotta on the other side. That strip of paper is rolled round the shaft of a screwdriver or something similar to make a tube and then glued, although if you use a screwdriver you don't want one with a wide blade at the end because you've got to slide the pot off afterwards. Then I blacken the top of the pot with a marker. You can see the chimney pot at front here. The folded and glued chimney stack is at the back, and in between the small part for the chimney top. The chimney stack glues up against the side of the office, fitting into the notch in the office roof. Here's the instruction regarding the paving. This instruction didn't really seem to make much sense to me, as there wasn't enough paving provided for all of these options. Here's the chimney pot glued to the chimney top. I find the best way to do this is to apply quite a lot of glue to the chimney top and then sort of rub the pot round in it and then leave it to dry. Then that assembly glues to the top of the chimney stack. I glued paving along the side walls, first a strip cut for the rest of the side wall behind the office, and then a strip all along the other side wall. These paper parts were provided for a floor to the shed, but I didn't use them as it didn't seem to me that having a paper floor would be advantageous. It would just make it harder to fit the shed round the tracks, but if you wanted to, you could glue these parts to the bottom, making a floor for the shed. And here is the shed fitted around the tracks on my 3-rail tabletop. The front entrance isn't all that wide. There's barely enough room for the 2 tracks to enter and provide clearance for rolling stock. Hopefully it will work out okay. Even with the Metcalf double road shed on my main Hornby layout, I occasionally have problems with locos hitting the sides of the entrance. Here's the shed sort of from the back. I removed the buffers from the ends of the tracks and just fitted the back wall right up against the end of the tracks. You can't really see that end, and this provides more track space inside the shed. Here you can see the shed with the 00 goods depot beside it. I suppose it would have been more consistent if I'd used the 00 engine shed, but that's hard to find, and you'd need to get the shed and the shed extension, I think, to have a double road. Anyway, finally there it is. I have rather mixed feelings about this one. As always, if you have any questions about the build, please post in the comments below.